The deputy held the papers folded in thirds, the way a man holds something he does not want to hand over. Sleet ticked against his hat brim, mud sucked at his boots. A wagon sat loaded with an iron bedstead, 3 sacks of oats, and a cracked stove that had already gone cold. The woman in the doorway did not reach for the papers. She stood with one hand on the frame and the other on her daughter's shoulder, and the girl pressed against her hip, gripping a cracked blue mug because it was the only thing she had carried out herself. The deputy could not meet the woman's eyes when he said the farm was no longer hers. The farm had been hers for 12 years in every way that mattered, and in no way that held. Mara Devlin had cleared brush from the south field with Thomas the spring they married. She had dug the kitchen garden herself, stone by stone, while pregnant with Eamon. She had patched the barn roof after the ice storm of '83, working alone because Thomas had broken his wrist and could not grip a hammer. 12 years of labor pressed into that land like boot prints into clay. And on a wet Tuesday, in early March of 1888, a deputy she had never met handed her folded papers and told her the land belonged to someone else. The deputy's name did not matter. What mattered was the signature at the bottom of the page. Gerald van der Zee, nephew to the estate owner, had returned from Albany with debts that exceeded his inheritance and a lawyer willing to enforce what the lease had always allowed. The Devlins had worked the land on terms so vague, Thomas had once joked they were written on water. Thomas believed sweat gave him claim. The law did not agree. Thomas was 6 months dead from a wagon accident during harvest, and the law cared even less about a widow's sweat than a living man's. Mara had 2 children. Eamon was 9 and had his father's long hands. Claire was 6 and carried a cracked blue mug because it was the only thing she had grabbed from the kitchen shelf before the deputy told them to step outside. They stood in cold mud beside a wagon that held an iron bedstead, 3 sacks of oats, a cracked stove body with no clean pipe, and the clothes they wore. $4.70. That was what remained after Thomas's burial, the doctor's last visit, and the winter supplies she had stretched as far as flour and lard could stretch. $4.70 against a world that required firewood at $2 a cord, stovepipe at $8 fitted, and cartage labor at rates no woman alone could negotiate downward. She could not leave. She owed Moses Bell at the village store $29 carried on account since autumn. She had no living parents, no siblings within 300 miles, no rail fare west, and no legal claim to a single improvement Thomas had made to a farm that was never theirs. The road out was closed by debt. The road forward did not exist. What existed was a tower. 600 yards from the farmhouse gate, past a collapsed fence and a drainage ditch choked with dead cattails, stood a brick dovecote that once belonged to the old Van der Zee estate. It was round, 32 feet tall, and it stank. The upper 2/3 held hundreds of empty nesting holes arranged in tiers, their wooden ledges broken or rotted to splinters. Near the crown, a ring of arched openings faced the wind. They had once allowed pigeons to come and go. Now they allowed rain, snow, and whatever birds still remembered the place. The lower chamber was roughly 14 feet across. Its floor was packed with frozen droppings a foot thick in places. A door hung from one leather hinge. 3 of the lower windows had been bricked shut decades ago. The 4th gaped open, stuffed with straw that had gone black with mold. There was no stove draft, no chimney, no second room, no privy, no well within 200 yards, no road that a supply cart would willingly travel. The estate papers listed the Dovecote as unfit agricultural storage. This meant Gerald van der Zee did not want it. This meant Mara was legally permitted to occupy it, because no one with any power believed it was worth preventing. She moved the bedstead into the lower chamber on the first afternoon. The iron legs sank into the droppings. The smell hit Claire so hard the girl vomited onto Mara's boots. Eamon said nothing. He set his mother's kettle on the floor and looked up through the broken interior stair at the rows and rows of empty holes climbing toward the sky. That night, Mara burned 1/4 of her usable wood to get the cracked stove hot enough to boil water. The pipe leaked smoke from 3 joints. The heat rose through the open stairwell and vanished into the upper roost where no birds lived. By midnight, the stove was cold, and the frost had crept back across the inner wall like a hand reclaiming what it owned. She needed at least 2 cords of wood to survive the remaining cold weeks by conventional means. She had less than a quarter cord. She needed $8 for a sound stovepipe and damper. She needed another 6 for cartage and repair labor. She needed food enough for 3 people until spring hiring began. She had $4.70 and a building that every person in the valley considered a ruin. Abram Varick arrived on the 3rd morning. He was 64, thin as a fence rail, and he walked with the particular authority of a man who had managed other people's property for 40 years. He had been steward of the Van der Zee estate before Gerald's father died, and he knew every barn, tenant house, smokehouse, cistern, and storage building on the land. He had wintered animals in structures most men would not enter. He had buried 2 tenants who froze in buildings he told them not to occupy. He did not knock. The door would not have survived knocking. He pushed it open with one hand and stood in the threshold, breathing through his mouth against the smell, and he looked at Mara Devlin sitting on the iron bedstead with her children on either side of her and a pot of cold oats between them. "I came to see whether you were alive," Varick said. "We are alive," Mara said. Varick looked up. He looked at the cracked stove. He looked at the walls where moisture beaded on the brick and ran in thin lines to the floor. He walked to the far side of the chamber and pressed his palm flat against the stone. He held it there for 3 seconds and pulled it away. "You have brick that sweats," he said. "Mortar that sheds sand when you lean on it. A stove that will smoke you blind before it warms you, and not enough wood to boil wash water for a week." He crossed to the stairwell and looked up. He did not climb. He did not need to. His hand tested the first step, and the wood bowed under his fingers. He pointed to the upper roost where broken nesting ledges hung like loose teeth from the inner wall. "Those roosts have not been kept in 20 years. The shelves are rotted through. Rats will come before birds do. Disease follows rats. And the first hard freeze after rain will split loose bricks from the crown and drop them through the stairwell onto whoever is fool enough to sleep below." He turned back to the door and ran his thumb along the frame. Mortar crumbled and fell in a line of gray dust. "This frame will not hold a fitted door. You would need to rehang it entirely. $2 in hardware alone and a man's labor for a day." He pointed at the stove. "That body is cracked from the firebox to the collar. Even with sound pipe, it will leak smoke at every joint. You would poison yourself before you warmed yourself." Mara listened. She did not interrupt. Interrupting a man like Varick spent energy she could not afford. Every objection he raised was accurate. Every number he cited was real. He was not telling her what he believed. He was telling her what he knew. And what he knew was that the building around her was a catalog of ways to die slowly. "How much for enough firewood?" she asked. Varick calculated silently. His lips moved. 2 cords to see March out, if March behaves. 3 if it does not. $8 for the wood. 4 for the cartage. And you would still need pipe work. "I have $4.70. Varick looked at the children. Eamon looked back. Claire pressed against Mara's side. "A woman cannot winter in a pigeon tower," Varick said. He said it the way a man states the weight of an object he has already lifted. Not cruel, certain. "Where should I go?" Mara asked. Varick did not answer. He looked at the broken stair, the sagging door, the frost on the inner wall, the useless stove leaking smoke from joints a child could see. He saw a woman who had run out of choices sitting inside a building that offered none. "You should not be here," he said. Then he left. The door swung open behind him. Cold air flooded the room. Eamon got up and wedged it shut with the kettle. Mara sat still. She could feel her children's warmth against her sides. She could feel the cold pressing in from every surface that was not alive. She looked up at the empty roosts and thought about what Varric had not measured. On the second night, Eamon's cough woke her. It was the deep, barking kind that shook the bedstead and made Claire whimper in her sleep. The stove had gone cold 2 hours before. Mara could see her breath. Frost rimmed the inside of the lower wall in patterns that looked like fern leaves pressed into glass. She wrapped the blanket tighter around both children and climbed the broken inner stair to check for leaks. The steps were treacherous. 2 were missing entirely. She gripped the brick wall and pulled herself up by the strength of her fingers, testing each board with 1 foot before shifting her weight. She was checking for water coming through the upper openings. What she found was warmth. Not much. A breath of it. A difference so faint she might have imagined it if she had not been cold enough to notice every fraction of temperature around her. 3 pigeons had tucked themselves into old nesting holes near the second tier. Their bodies were invisible in the dark, but the brick around them was not as cold as the rest. Mara pressed her palm to the stone the way Varric had done downstairs. Then she moved her hand 6 inches to the right, away from the nesting hole. The difference was small. It was real. She stood in the dark on a broken stair inside a building that smelled of decades of bird waste, and she remembered her father. Patrick Devlin had been a tenant farmer in Ulster County before the family moved west to cheaper land. Mara was 10 the winter he took her into the cow barn after midnight to check on a heifer close to calving. The barn held 9 cows, 2 draft horses, and a pen of sheep. The air inside was warm enough that frost did not form on the walls. Her father had pressed her palm against the wall on the cow's side. Then he walked her to the empty tack room on the other end and pressed her palm to that wall. Same building, same night, same roof above them, 2 different temperatures. Living things pay rent in heat, he said. Every animal in that barn is a small fire that does not need wood. Mara had filed the lesson the way children file things that do not yet matter. 26 years later, standing in a ruin with a coughing child below her and 3 pigeons above, the lesson mattered. She climbed back down. She did not sleep. She sat on the bedstead with her back against the cold wall, and she thought. The tower did not need to become a normal house. She could not afford to make it one. But the tower already had something no normal house possessed. It had hundreds of nesting holes arranged in tiers from 8 feet above the floor to the crown. It had arched openings that faced the wind and the sky. It had been built 100 years ago to hold birds. Birds had lived in it by the thousands. Birds were warm. The logic assembled itself piece by piece, the way a wall goes up 1 stone at a time. If the upper chamber remained open to the sky, birds could enter freely during storms. Not trapped, not caged. Simply offered shelter that matched what they already sought. If the lower chamber were sealed and reduced in size, its walls stuffed, its cracks filled, its doorway blocked tight, it would hold heat the way a root cellar holds cold. And if a thin ceiling separated the 2 chambers, something that let warmth press downward but kept the birds, their droppings, and their noise above, then the heat of hundreds of living creatures would do what her quarter cord of wood could not. She did not need to make more fire. She needed to stop losing the heat already alive above her. The design took shape in her mind. Upper chamber left open for birds, lower chamber sealed for people. Between them, a thin conductive ceiling, salvaged tin sheets, if she could find them, flattened and overlapped, tight enough to keep droppings out, thin enough to let warmth through. Thick boards would insulate. She did not want insulation, she wanted transmission. Around the lower walls, lime wash to seal the brick, rags, paper, straw, and clay packed into every crack, quilts hung against the stone, the room reduced from 14 feet across to 10, maybe less. Heat a small space, lose less. At the upper entries, the arched openings left clear, no screens, no shutters. Birds must come and go freely, or they would not come at all. At floor level, a small vent, controlled, enough air to breathe, not enough to steal what the birds were giving. The risk was obvious. If she sealed too tightly, damp and foul air could harm the children. If she left too much draft, all heat escaped. If birds did not come in sufficient numbers, the entire effort was a coffin she had built herself. If Varick reported the tower as a public nuisance, Gerald van der Zee's lawyer could evict her from even this ruin. And if she was wrong about the heat, she would have spent her last dollars and her last days of strength on a theory born from a memory and 3 sleeping pigeons. Eamon coughed again. The sound filled the tower from floor to crown. Mara pressed her palm against the wall. Cold. She pressed it against her son's forehead. Warm. Living things pay rent in heat. She would collect. Nellie Tuttle came on the 5th day. She was 41, a widow herself. 3 winters survived alone on a hardscrabble farm a mile east. Her face had the windburned clarity of a woman who had stopped asking for help and started measuring what she had. She had heard from a neighbor's boy that Mara Devlin was scraping the pigeon tower floor with a hoe. Nellie found Mara on her knees, chipping frozen droppings from the base of the wall with a flat stone. The lower chamber was half cleared. Mara's hands were cracked and bleeding at the knuckles. The smell was powerful enough to water Nellie's eyes from the doorway. "What are you doing?" Nellie asked. "Cleaning," Mara said. "For what?" Mara did not answer immediately. She stood, wiped her hands on her skirt, and looked at Nellie with the particular expression of a woman calculating whether honesty would cost more than silence. "I'm going to heat this room with birds," Mara said. Nellie stared. She looked up at the empty roosts. She looked at the cracked stove, the iron bedstead, the 2 children sitting on a blanket against the far wall, eating cold oats from a shared bowl. "You cannot heat children with birds," Nellie said. "You can foul them with birds, you can sicken them, but you cannot tuck them under wings." Mara did not argue. She crossed the chamber, took Nellie's wrist, and pulled her toward the stair. Nellie resisted, then followed. They climbed together to the 2nd tier where the 3 pigeons had roosted 2 nights before. The birds were gone now, but Mara pressed Nellie's palm against the stone near the nesting hole, then moved it to the empty wall 6 inches away. Nellie held still. Her mouth tightened. "That is 3 birds," Mara said. "I need 300, maybe more." 300 birds will not make a fire," Nellie said. "No, but they will make a difference, and a sealed room needs less of a difference than you think." Nellie pulled her hand back. She looked at Mara's bleeding knuckles, at the cleared floor, at the tin she had stacked against the wall, salvaged from a collapsed shed roof behind the estate house. "You're gambling your children's lives," Nellie said. "I'm gambling them either way," Mara answered. "I can freeze with no wood, or I can try this. There is no third path." Nellie left without helping, but she did not laugh. That was more than Mara expected. Even Moses Bell heard about the pigeon tower from the same neighbor's boy who had told Nellie Tuttle. But Bell heard the story differently. He heard opportunity. Bell was 48, the village storekeeper, and the man who held nearly every small debt within 6 miles of Kinderhook Creek. He was not tall, but he had the kind of bulk that suggested comfort rather than labor. His face was friendly, in the way a closed hand is friendly when it offers to open. He smiled when he calculated. He held Mara's $29 debt and had already priced Thomas Devlin's tools, the plane and auger and draw knife that Mara kept wrapped in oilcloth beneath the bedstead. If Mara failed, those tools came to him. If she collapsed entirely, he might acquire whatever scraps of dignity she had left and turn them into credit at a profit. The store was the village's only reliable gathering place, and Bell used it the way a stage manager uses a theater. When Mara's name came up, he was ready. Mara Devlin has found herself a castle, Bell said, loud enough for the three men at the counter and the woman sorting thread by the window. Shame the court gave it to the birds first. The room laughed. The joke was safe. A widow living under pigeons confirmed what many already believed. She had fallen below the line where respectability could be expected and pity could be withheld. The laughter spread the way laughter does in small places. Boys left feathers on the tower threshold. Someone chalked Dove Queen on a broken board leaning against the outer wall. Women at church found reasons to avoid asking where the children slept. A hired man stopped Mara on the road and offered to buy Thomas's plane and auger for 50 cents. Before Rust takes them, he said, as though Rust were the danger and not a man offering a widow a fraction of what her husband's tools were worth. Mara walked to Bell's store on the 7th day. She needed lime for the walls, lamp oil, and a roll of cheap wire for hanging the tin sheets. The store smelled of tobacco, salt pork, and dried apples. 3 men sat near the stove. Bell stood behind the counter with his ledger open. Lime, oil, and wire, Mara said. Bell looked up. Planning improvements to the castle? One of the men at the stove grinned. I mean to keep my children warm, Mara said. Then buy wood like a sane woman, Bell replied. How much for the lime? Bell named prices. Lime at $1.10, oil at 40 cents for a half gallon, wire at 60 cents for a 10-yard coil. The total consumed nearly everything. Mara laid $4 on the counter. Bell counted it and pushed back 60 cents in change. Credit is closed, he said when she reached for the lime. I paid in full. For what is on the counter? Your account carries $29. I cannot extend further until that clears. He tapped the ledger. Unless you want to sign the tools against it. The plane alone would cover $8, fairly valued. Thomas's tools are not for sale. Thomas is dead, Mrs. Devlin. Tools do not grieve. Mara took the lime, the oil, and the wire. She carried them herself. The lime sack weighed 40 pounds. She stopped every quarter mile to rest, setting it down on the frozen mud and pressing her split palms against her skirt to blot the blood. Eamon carried the oil. Claire carried the wire, looped over her small shoulder like a necklace made for a giant. The town saw them walking. Some laughed from doorways. Some turned away from windows. Nobody helped. The construction began the next morning, and Mara understood immediately that she was doing it wrong. She had started wetting the frozen droppings to loosen them. The water froze. The slurry became a skin of ice over filth that was harder to remove than the filth alone. She chipped at it for 3 hours and cleared less than she had managed dry the day before. Her knuckles bled fresh. Eamon tried to help and slipped, cutting his palm on a frozen edge of waste. That was when Barbro Vangen appeared. She was 62, Norwegian, and she stood in the doorway the way a woman stands when she has already decided whether to enter. Her left hand was bent at a permanent angle from an old burn. The fingers curled inward so that she gripped things between her palm and the base of her thumb. She wore a wool coat that had been patched so many times the original fabric was an open question. Her eyes were the pale gray of river ice, and they were fixed on the wet floor. "You are making mud," Barbro said. Mara looked up. She did not know this woman. "The droppings. You wet them. Now they are worse." "I was trying to loosen them." "Dry scrape first. Flat hoe. Short strokes." Barbro stepped inside. She took the hoe from where it leaned against the wall and demonstrated. 3 sharp strokes lifted a crust of dried waste from the brick without wetting anything. She scooped the dry material into a barrel Mara had salvaged from the estate grounds. "The clean powder you save. Gardeners will trade for it. The wet waste you pile outside and let it freeze. Deal with it in spring." "Who are you?" Mara asked. Barbro Vangen. I washed linen and tended birds on the Greenheim farm for 11 years before I came to this valley. I heated washrooms with animal warmth when the wood ran out. She said it the way she might have said she had once eaten bread, a fact. Nothing more. Barbro looked up at the roosts. She looked at the tin sheets stacked against the wall. She looked at the wire, the lime, and the oil. She looked at the cracked stove and the children sitting on the bedstead, watching her with the careful attention of small animals gauging a stranger. You mean to use the birds, Barbro said. Yes. Barbro pressed her good hand against the wall. She held it there. She moved it upward, testing brick after brick, the way a doctor moves a hand across a chest, listening for what is wrong underneath. The mortar here is sound, she said, tapping one section. She moved her hand left. Here it is sand. Air comes through. You will lose everything you gain unless you close what leaks. She was not offering help. She was diagnosing. The difference mattered. Will it work? Mara asked. Barbro looked at her. The look held something Mara had not seen from Varric, from Nellie, or from anyone since Thomas died. It was not pity. It was not doubt. It was recognition. I do not know, Barbro said, but you are not stupid for trying. You are stupid for using water on frozen waste. She picked up the hoe and began scraping. Her bent hand gripped the handle at an angle that should have been awkward, but was not. She worked faster than Mara. Eamon got up from the bedstead. He found a flat stone and began scraping beside them. Nobody spoke for an hour. The barrel filled. The floor emerged brick by grimy brick, and beneath the filth, the surface was sound. Barbro's first lesson arrived without announcement. When half the floor was cleared, she stopped and hung a strip of cloth from a nail near the doorframe. The cloth trembled. There, she said. You see it. A draft. Every draft is heat leaving. Every crack is a thief. Before you build your ceiling, before you hang your tin, you find every thief and you stop them. Make the boy hold a candle at the door. Watch the flame. Eamon held the candle. The flame leaned toward the interior. Air was being pulled inward through cracks Mara could not see, rising through the open stairwell and escaping through the upper holes. The tower was breathing. Every breath stole warmth. The enemy is not cold air, Barbro said. It is moving air. Stop the movement and you change everything. Mara watched the candle flame bend and tremble. She thought of Varric pressing his palm to the sweating wall. She thought of her father pressing her palm to 2 different walls in a cow barn 26 years ago. She thought of 3 pigeons in the dark and the faint difference they made in the stone. The flame leaned. The air moved. Heat fled upward into empty space. She had 14 days, maybe less, before the late winter storms arrived. She had 1 sack of lime, a roll of wire, salvaged tin, a cracked stove, and a woman with a burned hand who knew how to read walls. They worked the rest of that day sealing the lower walls. Mara mixed lime with water in a salvaged bucket and painted it over the brick in broad strokes, filling the surface pores where wind crept through. Barbro showed her how to press the lime deep into joints with the edge of a flat stick, rather than brush it across the top. Surface lime flaked off in days. Pressed lime held. Claire sat on the bedstead and tore rags into strips. She did not understand what they were for. She did it because her mother asked, and because the Norwegian woman with the bent hand said, "Good, longer," each time Claire held one up. Eamon carried buckets of frozen droppings outside and stacked them against the north wall, where Barbro said spring sun would dry them fastest for trade. By mid-afternoon, Mara's shoulders burned and her lower back seized when she bent too far. She had eaten nothing since morning. The oats were running low. She counted what remained in the 3rd sack and calculated 11 days of thin porridge for 3 people if she cut the portions again. Barbara noticed. She did not comment on the food. She said, "Sit," and took the lime brush. "The ceiling is next," Barbara said while she worked. "And the ceiling is everything. If you use thick boards, you seal the birds away and you seal the heat away with them. The warmth stays above where you cannot reach it. Then what? Thin metal, tin, sheet iron. Anything that warms when heat touches one side and gives it to the other. You overlap like fish scales, no gaps. The birds stay above. Their waist stays above, but the warmth presses down." She dipped the brush and painted another section of wall. Her bent hand braced the bucket against her hip. "On the Greinheim farm," Barbara said, "we heated the wash house through the cow wall. 30 cows on one side, a stone partition between, and the stone gave enough warmth to keep wash water from freezing overnight. The farmer thought it was the fire. It was never the fire. It was the cows." Mara turned one of the salvaged tin sheets in her hands. It was thin, pockmarked with rust, and it rang when she tapped it. A poor material by any standard, but it would conduct. "How many birds?" Mara asked. Barbara stopped painting. She considered the question the way she considered walls, by testing what she could feel rather than calculating what she could not. Enough to cover the roost thick. 200 might warm the tin. 500 would warm the room. More is better. You are not trapping them. You are inviting them. They must want to stay. And if they do not come, then you have a clean room with a metal ceiling and no heat, which is still better than what you have now. It was not reassurance. It was honesty measured to the gram. Mara took it and kept working. That night, a gust of wind knocked the stacked tin sheets off the wall and sent them clattering across the floor at 2 a.m. Claire screamed. Eamon scrambled from the bedstead and cut his foot on a bent edge. Mara lit the lamp and found blood on the brick and her son sitting against the wall holding his heel with both hands, his face white and his jaw set in a way that reminded her so sharply of Thomas that she had to turn away before she could speak. She bandaged the foot with a strip of Claire's rags and stacked the tin sheets flat on the floor with stones on top. Sleep did not return. The wind pressed against the arched openings above and made a sound like someone blowing across the mouth of a bottle. The tower was breathing again, and every breath reminded her how much work remained. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who could see the work but not the reason behind it? Barbara returned the next morning carrying a canvas sack of tools, a hand drill, a claw hammer with a wrapped handle, a tin snips that looked older than Mara, a ball of wire heavier than what Mara had bought from Belle, and a jar of flour paste mixed with ash that Barbara said would seal tin seams tighter than any caulk the store sold. "Where did you get these?" Mara asked. "I have been alive 62 years, Barbara said. "A woman collects." They began framing the ceiling. Barbara had Mara measure the interior at the height where she wanted the separation, 8 feet from the floor, just high enough for a grown person to stand. They nailed narrow joists across the diameter, bracing them against the brick walls with wooden wedges driven into the mortar joints. The first joist split. Barbara said nothing. She pulled it down, selected a different piece from the salvage pile, and tried again. The second joist held. Above them, through the broken stair and the empty roosts and the arched openings at the crown, the sky was the color of iron. Somewhere beyond the valley, weather was forming, weather that would test everything she built or bury everything she loved. By nightfall, 3 joists were set. Eamon counted 14 wall cracks sealed, and the candle flame held at the threshold barely moved. It was not enough. It was evidence. Barbara stood at the doorway, her bent hand resting on the frame. She watched Mara and the boy working and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "Faster, tomorrow. The air smells wrong." She walked into the dark. The temperature was dropping. Somewhere beyond the tree line, a bird called once and went silent, and the silence that followed held the weight of everything still to come. Barbaro was right about the air. The next morning broke gray and warm, the kind of false warmth that came before the worst cold in the Hudson Valley. Mara had lived through enough March turns to know the pattern. Warm rain first, then a shift, then the north wind that carried whatever the sky had been saving. She had 10 days. Maybe fewer. They worked from first light. Barbaro arrived carrying a bundle of salvaged tin she had pulled from a collapsed chicken house 2 miles east. Her bent hand gripped the bundle against her hip. The tin was thinner than what Mara had already collected, pocked with nail holes, but Barbaro said thin was better. Thin conducted. Thick insulated. They did not want insulation between the birds and the room. "Think of it as skin," Barbaro said. She held a sheet of tin against her forearm. "Your skin is thin. You feel heat through it. If your skin were thick as a board, you would feel nothing. The ceiling must be skin, not board." She showed Mara how to flatten the tin against a stone, working the dents out with the heel of her palm. The nail holes she sealed with plugs of cloth dipped in flour paste and pressed flat. Each plug took a minute. The first sheet had 11 holes. Mara counted them and tried not to count the hours. Eamon carried tin from the salvage pile. Claire sorted rags by length. The boy's cut foot had scabbed, but he limped, and each trip across the floor cost him a wince he tried to hide. Mara saw it. She said nothing. There was no one else to carry. By midday on the 9th day in the tower, the ceiling was half covered. 6 sheets of tin overlapped like fish scales across the joists, sealed at the seams with Barbaro's flour and ash paste. The paste dried gray and cracked at the edges, but Barbaro pressed it into the joints with a flat stick and said it would hold long enough. "Long enough for what?" Mara asked. "For the birds to decide." That was the question beneath every other question. The ceiling could be perfect. The walls could be sealed tight as a jar. The lower room could be reduced to 10 feet across with quilts and straw-backed boards narrowing the living space to a pocket of air small enough to warm. None of it mattered if the birds did not come. Barbaro's 4th lesson came that afternoon. She took a handful of oats from Mara's diminishing supply. Mara flinched, because each handful was a meal subtracted from her children, and climbed the outside ladder to the upper chamber. Mara followed. The upper roosts were a ruin of broken shelves and old nesting holes clogged with debris. But the arched openings near the crown were clear, and through them Mara could see the valley stretching gray and flat toward the creek. The wind moved through the openings and stirred dust and old feathers across the floor. Barbaro scattered the oats along the widest ledge, near the openings where birds would enter. "Not inside the lower room," Barbaro said. "Never below. Grain goes here, near the sky. The birds come for shelter. The grain tells them this shelter has food. They stay because both are here. You do not trap them. You do not close the holes. They must feel free, or they will not roost." "How do you know they will come at all?" Barbaro pointed through the nearest arch. A dozen pigeons sat on the estate barn roof 400 yards away. Another cluster perched on the church steeple in the distance. "They are already looking," Barbaro said. "When the weather turns, they will look harder. This tower was built for them. The holes are the right size. The ledges face the right direction. They remember places their grandmothers roosted, the same way you remember your father's barn." Mara looked at the scattered oats, the empty nesting holes, the open arches. She was staking her children's survival on the memory of birds. She climbed back down. On the 10th day, Moses Bell made his move. A man Mara did not recognize appeared at the tower in the early afternoon. He wore a clerk's coat and carried a folded paper. He said he was sent by the constable's office to inspect conditions reported as a public nuisance. Mara asked who had reported it. The clerk said he was not at liberty to say. He looked at the tower, the tin ceiling half finished, the children, the barrels of dried droppings outside. He wrote something on the paper. He asked whether Mara was keeping livestock without permit. "Birds are not livestock," Mara said, "and they are not mine. They come and go through the upper holes." The clerk wrote again. He asked whether the structure had been assessed for habitation. Mara showed him the estate document listing the Dovecote as unfit agricultural storage. "Unfit storage is not fit habitation," the clerk said. "It is what I have." He left without closing the inspection. This meant it could be reopened at any time. This meant Bell now had a lever he could pull whenever he chose. Barbro, who had watched the entire exchange from the upper ladder without speaking, climbed down and said, "The man with the store." "Yes." "He wants you to fail. He wants my husband's tools. He wants whatever is left when I have nothing." Barbro's face did something complicated. Her mouth set. Her burnt hand curled tighter. "Then finish faster," she said. On the 11th day, they found the rat nest. It was behind a section of loose masonry in the lower wall, tucked into a gap between the outer and inner brick courses. Barbro heard the scratching first. She pulled 3 bricks free, and the nest spilled out, shredded cloth, old feathers, and dropping smaller and darker than pigeon waste. No rats inside. But the tunnel ran upward through the wall toward the roosts. Barbro sealed it with a mix of broken brick, clay, and lime pressed hard into the gap. She filled every opening she could reach and mortared the bricks back in place. The work took 4 hours. 4 hours they did not have. "Rats take eggs," Barbro said. "Rats take nestlings. If the birds smell rats, they will not stay. This wall must be sound." Eamon found a second tunnel near the floor. They sealed that too. By nightfall, Mara's hands were raw from mixing clay and lime. The skin across her knuckles had cracked and refused to heal because she could not stop working long enough for the cracks to close. She wrapped her hands in strips of cloth and kept going. The cloth turned brown with blood and gray with lime, and she changed it when the wrapping loosened and not before. That night, Barbro taught her the 5th lesson. She sat on the bedstead beside Claire, who was asleep, and she spoke quietly. "Warmth that poisons is not warmth," Barbro said. "It is only slower death. You must have a vent, small, controlled, a pipe or a gap at floor level that lets air enter, fresh and cold, while the warm air presses down from above. If you seal everything, the air inside will go bad. The children will breathe what the birds breathe. Damp will rot the straw. Mold will grow on the quilts. But a vent lets heat escape. A small vent lets a small amount escape. A sealed room lets everyone inside get sick. You choose the smaller loss." Mara nodded. She was too tired to argue. She was too tired to feel afraid. The fear had been replaced by a kind of mechanical clarity, the mind's last defense against exhaustion. Just do the next thing. She cut a hole in the base of the door the size of her fist and covered it with a flap of leather that could be opened or closed. Cold air trickled in along the floor. Warm air stayed near the ceiling. The flame of the lamp, set at waist height, did not flicker. Barbro watched and said, "Good." On the 12th day, rain came. It was not the rain of spring. It was the rain that comes before the worst of winter returns, heavy and warm enough to melt what little snow remained and soak everything that had been frozen dry. The straw pile outside the tower, which Mara had been saving for wall insulation, took the rain like a sponge. By afternoon it was heavy, dark, and steaming faintly in the cold air that followed the rain's edge. Wet straw behind the quilts would rot. Rotting straw bred mold. Mold in a sealed room could sicken everyone inside. Mara stood in the rain and looked at the ruined straw pile and felt the plan collapsing. The straw was the insulation. Without it, the quilts hung against bare brick, and the cold came through like the brick was not there. Barbro found her standing outside and said, "Paper." "What?" "Newspaper, brown paper, flour sacks, anything dry that traps air. You do not need straw. You need stillness. Dead air does not conduct. Pack paper behind the quilts in layers. Crumple it. Do not flatten it. The crumples hold air." Mara had no newspaper. She had no flour sacks to spare. But the estate house, 300 yards away, had a carriage room stacked with years of old ledger paper that Gerald van der Zee's father had never discarded. She walked to the estate house in the rain. The door was locked. She walked around to the carriage room window, which was not locked because no one locks a window to a room full of paper. She climbed through and filled 2 grain sacks with crumpled ledger pages, receipts, and old correspondence that no living person wanted. She carried the sacks back through the mud. Her boots sank to the ankle. She fell once, and the sack split, and she gathered the wet pages from the mud and carried them against her chest. Barbro helped her pack the paper behind the quilts, layer after layer of crumpled sheets, pressed into the gap between fabric and brick. The paper rustled when wind hit the walls. It sounded like the tower was whispering. "One more day for the ceiling," Barbro said. "Then we scatter grain and wait." On the 13th day, Abram Varick returned. He came in the afternoon when the last section of tin was being nailed to the corner joists. Mara heard his boots on the threshold before she saw him. Barbro was on the ladder, holding a tin sheet in place with her bent hand, while Mara drove nails below. Varick stood inside the lower chamber and looked up. The ceiling was complete except for the corner where Mara was working. Overlapping tin sheets stretched from wall to wall, sealed at the seams, nailed to joists braced against the brick. Above the tin, through a gap at the stairwell opening, the upper roosts climbed into shadow. Below the tin, the lower chamber had been reduced to a squared room roughly 10 feet across. Quilts hung against the walls. Crumpled paper rustled behind them. The floor was scraped clean and lime-washed. The vent hole breathed at the base of the door. Varick pressed his palm against the tin. He held it there. He moved his hand across the surface the way he had moved it across the sweating wall 2 weeks earlier. "You have built a pan to catch sickness," he said. Barbro answered before Mara could speak. She did not climb down. She spoke from the ladder, looking down at Varick the way a woman looks at a man who has measured only half of what he claims to know. "No," Barbro said. "She has built a pan to catch what rises." "Heat does not rise from birds into rooms," Varick said. "Heat rises from everything alive. Stand where you are." Varick stood. Above him, 27 pigeons had settled into the upper roosts over the past 2 days. Not the hundreds Mara needed. A beginning. A colony that had found the grain and the shelter and returned. Varick held his palm against the tin. His expression did not change for 10 seconds. Then something shifted behind his eyes. The tin was not warm, but it was not as cold as the brick. "That is 27 birds," Barbro said. "She needs 2,700. "It will not be enough," Varick said. "You do not know that. And you do not know it will." He left without admitting anything, but he did not bring the constable. He did not tell Mara to leave. He walked out into the gray afternoon and turned once to look back at the tower, and the look on his face was not certainty anymore. It was the first crack in certainty, which is worse than doubt because it comes without permission. On the 14th day, Mara nailed the last tin sheet into place. Barbro sealed the final seam with paste. Eamon swept the lower floor. Claire hung the last quilt, standing on the bedstead to reach the wire. The lower chamber was finished. It was not a room anyone would choose. It was 10 feet across, 8 feet from floor to ceiling, walled with quilts over crumpled paper over lime-washed brick. The floor was bare stone, scrubbed white. The bedstead filled one side. A small shelf held the lamp, the kettle, and the cracked stove, which Mara had fitted with a shortened pipe that vented through a hole punched in the wall at shoulder height. The stove could heat water and cook oats. It could not heat the room. That was not its job anymore. Above the tin ceiling, the upper chamber climbed 24 feet to the crown. Hundreds of nesting holes lined the walls, grain scattered on the widest ledges. The arched openings faced the valley, and through those openings, birds were arriving. Not enough, not yet, but arriving. Barbro owned a small alcohol thermometer from her years of laundry work when she needed to know whether wash water was hot enough to clean without being hot enough to scald. She lent it to Mara with a condition. "Do not stare at numbers more than you stare at the children's faces," Barbro said. "Numbers tell you what has already happened. Faces tell you what is about to." Mara hung the thermometer from a nail on the central joist and promised. That first cold, clear night, the temperature outside dropped hard enough to crust the water skins left on the ground. Inside the lower chamber, with 40 to 60 birds roosting above the tin, the air was not warm, but the tin ceiling lost its knife-cold bite. Mara pressed her palm against it and felt something other than cold for the first time since she had entered the tower. With 100 birds above, frost retreated from the ceiling seam. The thermometer read just above freezing. The children slept 4 hours without waking. Claire did not shiver. Eamon did not cough. This was not victory. It was evidence. Nellie Tuttle heard from someone who heard from someone that Mara's tower was holding warmth without fire. She came on the 16th day and pressed her palm to the ceiling the way everyone pressed their palm to the ceiling, because it was the only proof that mattered. "One mild night proves nothing," Nellie said. "Spring is coming anyway." Varric, told by the same chain of whispers, said the same thing differently. "She is gambling against a storm that may not arrive. If March stays gentle, she will claim the method worked. If March turns, she will learn what she has built." Bell, who heard everything that moved through the village, the way a spider feels everything that touches the web, spread a new rumor. He told the store customers that bird sickness would kill the children before weather did. He said he had read about pigeon lung in a medical almanac. He said Mara Devlin was not resourceful. She was reckless, and reckless mothers lost children. No one repeated Bell's words to Mara directly. They did not need to. She saw it in the way people looked at her when she came to the well. She saw it in the way the hired man who had offered 50 cents for Thomas's tools now would not meet her eyes. Barbro noticed first, not the gossip, the sky. On the morning of March 10th, she arrived at the tower before dawn and said 3 words. "They know before." Mara came to the doorway. The air was strange, warm and still in a way that felt like a held breath. To the south, the sky was clear. To the northwest, behind the ridgeline, a wall of cloud sat low and dark and did not move. Barbro pointed to the estate barn. Pigeons that normally spread across rooftops and fence lines were clustered along the south eave, pressed tight together. Along the church steeple, the same. Along the stone wall near the creek, birds sat in rows facing the same direction. "When they gather like that," Barbro said, "they're not resting. They're deciding where to go." The air smelled of wet iron and something else, something electric that prickled the skin. The warmth was wrong. March warmth before a storm was not a gift. It was bait. Mara looked at the tower. She looked at the arched openings where a dozen birds sat watching the sky. She looked at the hundreds of empty nesting holes above the tin ceiling that she had cleaned and cleared and scattered with grain. The room was ready. The ceiling was sealed. The walls were stuffed. The vent was set. Everything depended on what happened next. The great blizzard announced itself with rain. It came on the afternoon of March 11th, heavy and warm, turning the roads to soup and the fields to shallow lakes. By evening, the rain thickened. By midnight, it was ice. And then the wind came from the north like a door slamming across the entire valley, and the rain became snow, and the snow became a wall. Mara had pulled the bedstead to the center of the room. She had sealed the door with rags and wedges. She had filled the water bucket and set it inside. She had fed the children the last full meal of oats and salt pork and told them to sleep while they could. Eamon asked if they were going to be all right. Mara said, "We built well." She did not know if that was true. Above the tin ceiling, the sound changed. First, it was fluttering. A few birds entering through the arched openings, driven from exposed roosts by the wind. The tin ticked as small feet moved above. Then more. The fluttering became a rush, wings hitting brick, bodies crowding into nesting holes. Mara could hear them jostling for position, the territorial cooing that rose in pitch as space grew scarce. Then the sound changed again. It was no longer individual birds arriving. It was a mass, a living pressure building above the tin, the sound of hundreds of creatures driven by the same primal directive. Find shelter, find warmth, find walls. The tin ceiling vibrated faintly. Mara pressed her palm against it and felt the metal alive with movement. Something struck the central joist from above, and the whole ceiling shuddered. She reached for the ladder. "Stay," Barbaro said. Barbaro had arrived an hour before the snow and refused to leave. She sat on a stool near the vent and watched the ceiling the way she watched everything, with her hands, pressing her good palm against the tin and reading what the metal told her. "The beams," Mara said. "If they fail, they will not fail. I built them. But the birds may panic if we climb into their space. Let them settle." Mara sat. She listened. The wind outside hit the tower like something thrown. Snow found cracks no one had sealed, tiny gaps at the crown where mortar had crumbled, and fell through the upper chamber in thin white threads that dissolved before reaching the tin. The birds kept coming. The sound above was no longer fluttering or cooing. It was a continuous living murmur, the sound of breath and heartbeat and body heat pressed into brick and tin and old wood. The tower had been designed to hold 2,000 pigeons in its prime. Mara did not know how many were above her now. She knew only that the tin ceiling, which had been cold to the touch an hour ago, was growing warm. Not warm like summer, warm like a hand held near a face. Warm enough that the frost line, which had crept across the seam between tin and brick each night since they finished, stopped creeping and began to melt. Barbaro held the thermometer under the lamp to read it. 41 degrees, she said. And rising. Outside, the wind screamed. Mara could hear nothing from the village. No church bell, no wagon, no voice. The world beyond the tower walls had been erased by snow-driven horizontal across the valley. Claire's fever began 2 hours after midnight. Mara felt it before she measured it. The girl's forehead against Mara's lips burned in a way that had nothing to do with the warming room. Claire's breathing had gone shallow and fast, the kind of breathing that meant the lungs were fighting something the body could not name. Mara boiled water on the cracked stove and made a cloth compress. She held it against Claire's chest and counted breaths. 15 in a minute, 18, 20. The girl's eyes were open but unfocused, tracking things in the lamplight that were not there. Fever likes sealed rooms, Barbro said quietly. She opened the vent a fraction wider. Cold air slid along the floor. The thermometer dropped 1 degree. Mara pulled Claire closer. The girl weighed nothing. She was 6 years old, and she weighed nothing, and the room was warm enough to live in, and the fever did not care. That was when someone pounded on the door. The sound was so violent that Eamon jerked upright on the bedstead, and Claire whimpered. The pounding came again. A fist, a voice behind it, ragged and broken by wind. Mara looked at Barbro. Opening the door meant losing heat. Every degree the room had gained had come from the birds above and the sealed walls around and the still air inside. Opening the door meant inviting the storm into the space they had spent 2 weeks building. The pounding came a third time. Mara pulled the wedges and the rags and dragged the door inward. Snow blasted across the floor in a sheet of white. The lamp flame flattened. Above, the birds panicked. Wings beat against brick. The tin ceiling rattled like a drum. Claire screamed. Nellie Tuttle stood in the doorway. She was coated in ice from the waist down. Her hair was frozen to the side of her face. In her arms she held her teenage son Rafe, whose hands hung at his sides white and stiff, the fingers curled inward like Barbro's, but from cold, not fire. His lips were the color of old ash. "The chimney," Nellie said. Her voice was barely a voice. "Backdrafted. Smoke. We ran." Mara grabbed Nellie's shoulder and pulled them both inside. Eamon threw himself against the door. The wind fought him. He weighed 60 pounds and the wind weighed more. Barbro got off the stool and put her shoulder beside his, and together they forced the door shut. The tin ceiling still rattled. Birds above were beating against the walls. The sound was terrifying. A living thunderstorm inside the brick, feathers and waste falling through the gaps at the stairwell opening. "The birds," Mara said. "They will settle," Barbro said. "They always settle. Shut the cracks." Eamon stuffed rags along the threshold where snow had blown in. Mara guided Nellie to the bedstead and lowered Rafe onto the blankets beside Claire. His hands were the worst, white to the wrist. The skin had the waxy texture of frozen meat. Barbro knelt beside him. "Do not put them near the stove," she said. "Do not rub them. Warm the center of his body first. Wrap his chest. His body will warm his hands if his body is warm enough." Nellie, the practical skeptic, the woman who had said you cannot heat children with birds, stood in the center of the room and felt the air. She turned in a slow circle. Her ice-stiffened coat crackled. She looked at the tin ceiling where the birds were settling one by one, the panic subsiding into the murmur of 1,000 creatures finding their places. She looked at the quilted walls, the crumpled paper, the small vent breathing at the base of the door. "How?" Nellie said. It was not a question. It was the sound of a woman's certainty breaking. The thermometer had fallen to 38 degrees when the door opened. With the door sealed and the birds settling, it stopped falling. Then it began to climb. 39, 40. The room was not warm, but it was alive with heat that came from above, heat that pressed through tin and into air and kept 5 people and 2,000 birds breathing through a storm that had buried the road and silenced the valley. If you are invested in this story, stay with us, because what happens next may save a life, or it may cost every bit of warmth they have left. 3 hours later, another knock came. This one was different, not desperate, deliberate. 3 measured strikes against the wood, the knock of a man who had walked a long way and used the last of his strength to reach the door. Mara opened it. Abram Varick stood in the snow. He was hatless. His coat was white from shoulder to knee. In his arms he carried a child wrapped in a horse blanket, a boy from the tenant house near the creek, no older than Claire, unconscious and limp. Varric's authority was gone. The man who had walked her tower and listed every way it would fail stood at her threshold with a dying child in his arms and no words left in his mouth. "Is there room?" he asked. Mara looked at the ceiling. She listened to the birds, 2,000 lives above, pressing heat into tin, which pressed heat into air, which kept the room just warm enough to hold the line between living and dying. She looked at Claire, feverish on the bedstead. She looked at Rafe, whose lips were beginning to show color. She looked at Barbaro, who had not slept and would not sleep. She looked at Eamon, who was already pulling the door wider. "Yes," Mara said. Varric stepped inside. Eamon closed the door. The boy was laid beside Claire. Barbaro wrapped him in a blanket and felt his chest and said his heart was strong, but his skin was dangerously cold. 7 people in a room 10 feet across beneath a ceiling of hammered tin, above a floor of scrubbed brick, inside a tower built for birds that the village had called a ruin and a punishment and a joke. The thermometer climbed. With more bodies below and thousands of birds above, the balance shifted. Heat generated from 2 directions, from the living roof and from the living room, and the tin between them conducted it in both directions, evening the temperature across the sealed space. Barbaro read the thermometer at 4 in the morning. 58 degrees near the center, she said. She moved the instrument to the wall. 44 degrees here. By dawn, the center read 62. Claire stopped shivering. Her breathing slowed from 20 breaths a minute to 14. The compress on her chest was warm to the touch. Rafe's lips turned from ash to pale pink. He opened his eyes and asked where he was. His hands were still white, but the wax was gone from the skin. Blood was returning, pushed outward from a center that Barbaro had warmed first. The tenant boy woke and cried for his mother. Varric held him on his lap and said nothing. The man who had managed estates and measured buildings and known the winter capacity of every structure in the valley sat beneath the tin ceiling he had called a sickness trap and listened to the birds shifting above him and said nothing at all. The storm did not break until afternoon of the 2nd day. During that time, the world outside the tower went to pieces. Bell broke the walnut counter leaf from his store to feed his stove. 2 families burned fence rails. A man on the road near the creek was found later, frozen beside a stone wall he had tried to shelter behind. His name was Goss, and he had been walking to the tannery for work. The church chimney backed up with snow, and the sexton's wife opened the wrong window, trying to clear the smoke, and the cold poured in, and they spent the night in the sacristy wrapped in altar cloths. Mara's tower burned almost no wood. She fed the cracked stove twice to boil water and heat broth. The heat that kept 7 people alive came from above, from 2,000 birds that had entered the tower because the arched openings faced the wind, and the nesting holes were the right size, and the grain on the ledges told them this place remembered what it was built for. On the 2nd morning, the wind stopped. The silence was sudden and enormous. Mara opened the vent and listened. Nothing. No church bell, no voice, no animal sound, just snow settling. She opened the door. The world was white from the tower threshold to the tree line. Snow was piled above fence height. The road was gone. The drainage ditch was gone. The collapsed fence was a series of white humps that could have been anything. Above, in the upper chamber, birds began to leave. One by one, then in groups, they launched from the arched openings into the white morning and scattered across the valley. Their wings were the first sound other than wind that the world had made in 30 hours. Mara watched them go. The ceiling above her ticked and cooled as each bird departed. The room would not stay warm forever. The warmth was borrowed. It had always been borrowed, but it had been enough. Behind her, Varric stood in the doorway with the tenant boy on his hip. He looked at the tin ceiling. He looked at Mara. He touched the metal with the tips of his bare fingers. He said nothing, but his hand stayed there for a long time. The snow took 4 days to settle enough for walking. By then, every household within 6 miles of Kinderhook Creek knew 2 things. A man named Goss had frozen beside a stone wall on the Tannery Road, and Mara Devlin's pigeon tower had kept 7 people alive through the worst night without burning more than a handful of kindling. The second fact traveled faster than the first. Varric came back on the 5th day after the storm. The snow was still piled above fence height in the hollows, but the road had been broken by ox-drawn sledges, and the sun had a weak, determined quality that meant the worst was over. Varric walked the half-mile from the estate house carrying a measuring cord and a carpenter's pencil. He did not bring the constable's clerk. He did not bring Gerald van der Zee's lawyer. He brought the tools of a man who intended to understand something he had dismissed. Mara was outside the tower, shoveling a path from the door to the well. The children were inside. Barbro had gone home 2 days prior, walking through knee-deep snow with the particular stubbornness of a woman who would not be kept anywhere she had not chosen to stay. Varric stopped at the edge of the cleared path and looked at the tower. Bird tracks patterned the snow around the base. Meltwater had run down the brick from the arched openings and frozen into glassy streaks. The upper roosts were still occupied. Not 2,000 birds now, but several hundred who had found the grain and the shelter and decided to remain. "I would like to see it again," Varric said. Mara leaned the shovel against the wall. She opened the door. Varric entered the lower chamber and stood in the center. He looked at the ceiling, the walls, the vent, the quilted insulation, the crumpled paper visible where one quilt had pulled loose from its wire. He pressed his palm to the tin. The birds above shifted. The metal was faintly warm. He unwound the measuring cord and stretched it across the room. He measured the diameter. He measured the ceiling height. He took the carpenter's pencil from his coat and wrote numbers on the back of his own hand. 10 feet 2 inches across, he said. 8 feet 1 inch to the ceiling. The tin is, what, a 1/16 of an inch? Less in places, Mara said. Some sheets are thinner than others. Varric wrote that down too. He looked at the vent hole at the base of the door. He knelt and held his hand in front of it and felt the cold air entering along the floor. "How did you know to put the vent at the bottom?" he asked. "Cold air falls. Warm air rises. The vent feeds cold air at the floor. The warm air stays near the ceiling. They do not mix unless the room is too large." "Who taught you that?" "Barbro Vangen, and before her, my father, and before him, anyone who has watched a candle flame lean toward a crack." Varric stood. He looked at the ceiling one more time. He pressed his palm against it one more time. Then he said quietly, as though admitting it to the room rather than to Mara, "I measured the tower wrong." "The height?" Mara asked. "The value." He did not become warm. He did not smile or apologize or tell her she had been brave. He became something more useful than any of those things. He became precise. "The estate has 4 outbuildings with bird access," Varric said. "The stable loft, the carriage house eave, the old creamery, and the equipment shed which has a pigeon colony in the rafters that I have been trying to drive out for 6 years. If your method works at this scale, parts of it may apply to those buildings." "It is not my method," Mara said. "It is physics. Heat rises. Birds are warm. Thin metal conducts. Any building with animals above and people below can use the same principle if the room is small enough and the drafts are stopped." Varric wrote on his hand again. Then he looked at her. "I will keep Bell's clerk away," he said. The inspection is closed." He left. He did not say he was sorry. He did not need to. He had given her something worth more than an apology: protection. Nellie Tuttle's conversion was slower and more practical. She came 3 days after Varick, carrying a smoked ham. She did not say the ham was a gift. She said she had more than she needed, and the salt was going bad. Both statements were lies, and both women knew it, and neither said so. Nellie examined the tower the way she examined everything, with her hands. She pulled back the quilts and looked at the paper. She pressed the tin and counted the nail heads. She climbed the outside ladder and looked at the upper roosts and came back down with pigeon waste on her boots and questions in her mouth. "How many birds does it take?" Nellie asked. "More than 100 to feel a difference. More than 500 to keep the room above freezing. During the storm, there were closer to 2,000. And the waste? Stays above the tin. Barbaro designed a cleaning hatch between the chambers. You open it in warm weather and shovel the waste into barrels. The droppings dry clean, and gardeners will trade vegetables for it. The smell? Lime wash, every 2 weeks on the upper walls. And the vent. Move-in air carries smell out. Still air holds it." Nellie sat on the bedstead and looked at the ceiling. She pressed her palm against the tin one more time, held it there, and did the calculation that every practical woman does when facing something she did not believe could work. She measured what she felt against what she knew, and what she felt was winning. Rafe's color had returned fully. His hands had healed without blackening, because Barbaro had known to warm the center of his body first rather than his fingers. He was home now, splitting kindling with hands that worked because a Norwegian woman understood frostbite. Nellie looked at her own hands on the tin and thought about her son's hands and said nothing for a long time. "My smokehouse has a loft," Nellie said finally. "It is small, 8 feet by 10. The chimney runs through it. In winter the smoke keeps birds away, but if I partitioned the loft and sealed the partition and left the eave open on the far side—" She stopped. She was designing without asking permission. "Show me the smokehouse," Mara said. They walked to Nellie's farm together through the snow. Mara carried a ball of wire and a bag of lime. Nellie carried the shovel. Nobody watching from the road would have known that one woman was teaching and the other learning, because Mara did not teach from above. She taught the way Barbaro had taught her, by standing beside someone and working. Within 2 weeks of the storm, 6 people came to the tower with questions. A young husband named Ansel Cady, whose wife Mary was pregnant and whose cabin had nearly killed them when the chimney backed up, asked whether animal heat could supplement a failing stove. Mara walked him through the principle: small room, thin barrier, animals above or beside, draft sealed, vent controlled. She made him hold a candle near his cabin door and watch the flame. She made him press his palm against the wall where his cow stood on the other side and feel the difference. Ansel asked how thin the barrier needed to be. Mara told him tin was best, but planks worked if they were no more than 1/2 inch thick. He asked about the vent. She showed him the leather flap at the base of the tower door. He asked how many animals were enough. She said 1 cow gave more heat than 50 pigeons, but the room had to be small enough to hold what the cow gave. He left with a list of measurements written on a piece of bark and a conviction that his wife would not freeze again. A woman from the creek road came to ask about lime wash schedules. A tenant farmer asked whether horse heat worked the same as bird heat. A boy from the church came because his mother sent him to memorize what he saw. Each time Mara demonstrated. She did not lecture. She placed hands on walls and held candles near cracks and let the physics speak for itself. She refused to sell the method. She refused to charge for her time. When Varick suggested she could make a trade of it, Mara said, "Warmth hoarded becomes another kind of cold." The contrast between the tower and the village was now measurable in ways people could not ignore. During the blizzard, Mara's tower had used less than a quarter cord of wood total, all of it for cooking and boiling water. The village had burned furniture, broken crates, fence rails, church storage benches, and in the case of one family near the creek, their own bedstead. The store shelves were half empty of lamp oil. The tannery had lost 3 days of production to frozen pipes. A woman on the Kinderhook Road had burned her last chair and spent the final night of the storm huddled with her children under every blanket they owned, shivering until dawn. Mara had slept. Her children had slept. The room had held 62 degrees near the center while the valley froze. That comparison worked on people the way water works on stone, slowly, silently, and without possibility of argument. She said it without thinking. It came from a place inside her that had been built during 2 weeks of sealed rooms and shared body heat, and a door opened twice in a blizzard when opening it could have killed everyone inside. Moses Bell heard all of it. He heard that Varick had measured the tower. He heard that Nellie was partitioning her smokehouse. He heard that Ansel Cady had started talking about cow walls and thin barriers at the tavern. He heard that people were using the phrase Devlin's method, as though a widow in a pigeon tower had invented something worth naming. His first response was mockery, because mockery was cheap and had always worked before. "So now we are all to live like pigeons," Bell said at the store. He said it with the smile that invited laughter, the smile that had turned Mara into a joke 3 weeks earlier. No one laughed. The silence in the store was louder than any response. 3 men stood at the counter. 2 women sorted goods near the window. All of them had spent the blizzard burning furniture, fence rails, or worse. One of the men had broken his own table for fuel. The woman by the window had lost a chicken coop to the weight of the snow and had spent 2 nights in a kitchen so cold the water bucket froze solid on the stove shelf. They had all heard about the tower. They had all heard about the 62 degrees. They had all heard that Mara Devlin's children slept through a night that killed a man on the Tannery Road. Bell's smile lasted 3 seconds before he understood that the room had shifted. He was standing on ground that was no longer his. His second response was ownership. 3 days after the failed joke, Bell appeared at the tower. He carried his ledger. He stood in the doorway and did not enter because Mara did not invite him in. "Your account stands at $29, Bell said. "Under the terms of credit, any valuable improvement made to property while the debt is outstanding may be claimed against the balance." "This is not my property," Mara said. "It is Vanderzee estate storage. I improved a building I do not own." "You improved it with materials purchased in part on my credit." "The lime, $1.10 worth, paid in cash." Bell tapped the ledger. "The debt is $29. The improvement is worth more. I have spoken with Gerald Vanderzee's agent. The tower, properly managed, could serve as a paid warming station, a place where families pay for shelter during storms, controlled through the store." Mara looked at him. She understood what he was doing with the precision of a woman who had spent 3 weeks learning to read the movement of air through brick. Bell did not want the tower. Bell wanted the principle. He wanted to insert himself between warmth and the people who needed it, the same way he inserted himself between goods and the people who bought them. He wanted a toll on survival. "The tower is not mine to give and not yours to take," Mara said. "We shall see," Bell said. He closed the ledger and walked away. Mara watched him go. She had survived the blizzard. She had survived the town's laughter. Now she had to survive the thing that came after survival, someone else wanting what she had built. Spring came slowly, the way it always came to the Hudson Valley, in arguments between warm days and cold nights, in mud that froze and thawed and froze again, in the sound of meltwater running under ice in the drainage ditch. Barbro came to the tower most days. She and Mara improved the system with the methodical satisfaction of two women who had proven a theory and now wanted to prove it better. They designed removable tin panels for the cleaning hatch. The panels slid on a wooden track and could be pulled out for scrubbing, then slid back into place without disturbing the ceiling seams. Barbro's bent hand was better at the fine work than Mara's cracked ones. She shaped the track edges with a rasp until the panels moved without binding. They built a small ash-lined shelf near the stove for warming stones. Stones heated in the morning held warmth through the evening and could be wrapped in cloth and placed in the bedstead. It was not bird heat. It was a supplement for nights when fewer birds roosted. They rigged a cord to the vent flap so it could be opened or closed from the bedstead without getting up. Barbro said a sleeping woman should be able to adjust the air without waking fully. "Sleep is medicine," she said. "Do not make medicine expensive." They developed a grain scatter pattern. Oats along the upper ledges near the arched openings where arriving birds would find them first. Nothing on the lower ledges, nothing near the stairwell, nothing that would draw birds downward toward the human space. Barbro said the pattern should make the upper roost feel generous, and the lower chamber feel empty. Birds follow food upward. People stay safe below. They argued. Mara wanted to leave the tower open to anyone during storms. Barbro said a room with too many people lost its air quality and gained its sickness. "6 is safe," Barbro said. 8 in an emergency. More than that, and you are not saving people, you are packing them. I cannot turn people away in a blizzard. You cannot save people by killing them slowly in a sealed room. The vent handles 6 breaths comfortably, 8 with the flap wide open. More than 8 and the air goes foul before morning. Then we make the vent larger. A larger vent loses more heat. There is a balance. You cannot escape the balance. They stood on opposite sides of the room, both with their arms crossed, both refusing to concede first. Eamon watched from the bedstead with the expression of a boy who had seen his parents argue about fence lines and recognized the same energy directed at ventilation. Mara conceded the number. Barbro conceded the principle. They agreed. 8 maximum in the lower chamber, but Mara would teach others to build their own sealed rooms in other buildings, so the need would spread across many shelters rather than crush one. It was the first time they disagreed as equals. It would not be the last, but it set the shape of their partnership. Barbro held the line on what physics allowed. Mara pushed the line on what compassion demanded. Between them, the method stayed honest. Barbro's health began to fail in late summer. It started with a cough that sounded wet in a way Mara recognized from Thomas's last autumn. Barbro dismissed it. She said Norwegian lungs were built for damp, and she had been coughing since she was 40, and it meant nothing. But by September, the cough had a sound that did not stop when Barbro stopped moving. It followed her. It woke her at night. It left her breathless after climbing the outside ladder, and then breathless after crossing the room, and then breathless after standing up from a chair. Damp lung fever. That was what the doctor in the village called it when Mara finally dragged Barbro to see him. He said rest. He said warmth. He said dry air. He said the things doctors say when they cannot say what they mean, which is that the lungs are filling and the body's losing a war it will not win. Barbro refused bed rest. She came to the tower every morning. She worked slower. She stopped climbing the ladder. She sat on the stool near the vent and directed while Mara and Eamon did the lifting and the nailing and the sealing. One afternoon in early October, Mara found her lime washing the upper hatch. Barbro had climbed the outside ladder without telling anyone. She was on her knees in the upper chamber, painting lime across the brick around the cleaning hatch, her bent hand holding the bucket, and her good hand holding the brush. Her breathing sounded like paper tearing. "Get down," Mara said from the ladder. "The lime must go on before the damp sets." "I will do it. Get down." Barbro stopped painting. She sat back on her heels and looked at Mara with the same expression she had worn the first day she walked into the tower, the look of a woman diagnosing what she saw. "You will do it wrong," Barbro said. "You always paint too thin." "Then show me the right thickness from below, where you will not die." Barbro came down. She did not climb the ladder again. Her final teaching was not about tin or lime or ventilation. It came on a cold evening in mid-October, when the first real frost had turned the drainage ditch white, and the birds were beginning to gather in the upper roosts in greater numbers, sensing what was coming. Barbro sat on the stool with a blanket around her shoulders. Claire sat on the floor beside her, leaning against Barbro's leg the way she had once leaned against Thomas. Barbro's bent hand rested on the girl's hair. "A room can be warm and still be mean," Barbro said. Mara looked up from the vent she was adjusting. "A room that charges for entry is mean," Barbro continued. "A room that counts who deserves warmth is mean. A room that saves only the people who built it is mean. You have built a warm room. Do not build a mean room." "I will not." "Bel will try to make it mean. Others will try after Bel. Warmth is power. People who have power make rules about who receives it. You must be the rule, Mara. Not the room, not the method. You." She coughed. The cough lasted 30 seconds and left her with blood on her lip and her eyes squeezed shut. When she opened them, she said, "Teach everyone, charge no one. That is how you keep the room honest." Barbro Vangen died on the 23rd of October in her own bed, in the small room she rented from a farmer's widow near the Kinderhook Road. Mara was with her. Eamon and Claire were with her. The room was warm because Barbro had sealed it herself, years before she met Mara, using the same principles she had learned on the Grindheim farm. Small space, stop drafts, and the body heat of 2 women and 2 children sitting close together in the dark. Mara held Barbro's bent hand and felt the last warmth leave it. She walked home through the October dark. The air smelled of fallen leaves and wood smoke. Somewhere in the upper roosts of the tower, birds were settling for the night, tucking their heads beneath their wings, adding their small fires to the brick. They did not know Barbro was gone. They would not know. The grain would still appear on the ledges. The arched openings would still face the wind. The tower would still be what it had always been, a place that offered shelter to things that flew. Mara did not weep that night. She sat on the bedstead between her sleeping children, and she pressed her palms together and felt the warmth of her own blood, and thought about all the hands that had touched these walls. Barbro's bent fingers painting lime, Varick's measuring palm, Nellie's testing grip, her father's rough hand in a cow barn in Ulster County, Thomas's hands, which she could no longer remember exactly, only the feeling of them, the calluses and the gentleness, and the way they held tools as though tools were partners and not possessions. 3 days later, Mara climbed the outside ladder to the upper chamber and found Barbro's handprint in dried lime on one of the upper bricks. It was small, crooked from the bent fingers, and permanent. The tower held many marks, from birds, from weather, from men who had owned the land and never set foot inside the building that stood on it. This mark was from a woman who had taught another woman how to stay alive. It would outlast every name in Gerald van der Zee's ledger. The weeks after Barbro's death were the loneliest Mara had known since Thomas died. She had work to do, and she did it. She cleaned the upper roosts. She repaired 3 nesting shelves that had cracked during the summer heat. She re-lime washed the lower walls and replaced the flour paste along the tin seams where moisture had softened it. She taught Eamon how to check the vent flap and how to read the thermometer, and how to scatter grain in the pattern Barbro had designed along the upper ledges, never near the stairs, never below. But the tower felt different without Barbro's voice in it. The silence where her instructions should have been was louder than the birds. Mara found herself pausing mid-task and listening for the sound of a bent hand gripping a tool, or the particular rhythm of Norwegian-accented English explaining why thin was better than thick and why warmth that poisoned was not warmth at all. She was alone with the method now. Barbro had given it to her the way a blacksmith gives a finished blade to the person who will carry it. The making was done. The carrying was Mara's. The November cold snap arrived without the courtesy of a warning. It was not a great blizzard. It was a sharp, sudden drop, temperatures falling 20 degrees in 6 hours on a Tuesday afternoon, catching half the valley with wash on the line and cattle unfed and children walking home from the schoolhouse in coats too thin for what the sky had decided. A tenant child named Peter Olmsted, 8 years old, went missing at dusk. His mother said he had gone to bring grain to the barn. The barn was 300 yards from the house. He did not come back. By the time the father reached the barn, the boy was not there. The grain sack sat on the threshold, half open, as though Peter had set it down to look at something and the cold had found him while he looked. The father came to Mara's tower because Mara's tower was now the place people came. Not the store, not the church, not Varick's estate house, the Pigeon Tower. The ruin that had been a joke 6 months earlier was now the first place a desperate man thought to go, because the woman inside it had proven she understood how cold worked and how to fight it. Mara organized the search the way Barbro would have organized it. She did not panic. She did not shout. She gave instructions in the same calm voice Barbro had used when birds were panicking against the ceiling and tin was rattling and a half-frozen boy lay on the bedstead with white hands. "How long has he been out?" Mara asked. "An hour, maybe more." "Which direction from the barn?" "The east field. He sometimes watches the birds at the stone wall." Mara sent Eamon to the stone wall with a lantern. She sent the father to the drainage ditch. She sent Nellie's boy Rafe, who had nearly died in this tower, and now came whenever Mara called, to check the estate outbuildings. Then she prepared the lower chamber. She stoked the cracked stove. She heated stones. She pulled blankets from the bedstead and hung them near the ceiling where the bird heat was strongest. She opened the grain sacks and prepared broth. Barbro's voice was in every action. Warm the center of the body first. Do not rub frozen skin. Block wind before adding fire. Keep vents open enough for breath. Use animals and people together when fuel is short. Rafe found Peter Olmsted in the equipment shed, curled beneath a broken cart with his arms wrapped around his knees. The boy was conscious, but could not speak. His lips were blue. His fingers were stiff. Rafe picked him up and carried him the way his mother had carried him 7 months earlier, running through cold toward a tower that should not have been warm, but was. The lower chamber received Peter Olmsted the way it had received Rafe and the tenant boy, and Varick himself, with heat that came from above, and from the walls, and from the people already inside. The birds in the upper roost numbered 300, less than during the blizzard, but enough to keep the tin warm. Mara wrapped Peter's chest first. She held heated stones against his ribs. She tipped broth into his mouth and watched his throat work. His fingers regained color within an hour. His voice returned within 2. His first word was cold, and his second word was hungry. And Mara fed him oats with salt and a piece of Nellie's smoked ham that had somehow lasted since March. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who understands that survival is often built before the danger arrives. Peter's father stood in the doorway of the tower and wept. He did not weep for the rescue. He wept because he understood how close the margin had been, and because the place that held the margin was a building his neighbors had once called a joke. Bell's response came within the week. He had watched the valley's center of gravity shift. Mara's tower was no longer a curiosity. It was a reference point. People mentioned it the way they mentioned the church or the store, as a fixed feature of the landscape that served a purpose everyone acknowledged. When the cold snap hit, no one had gone to Bell's store for warmth. They had gone to Mara's tower. That fact sat in Bell's mind like a stone in a boot. He petitioned Gerald van der Zee's nephew to revoke Mara's access to the tower. His argument was practical and, in its narrow way, reasonable. The tower attracted vermin, encouraged trespassers, and drew what he called pauper traffic to the estate grounds. He suggested the tower be leased commercially as a storage building. He did not say who would hold the lease. He did not need to. Varick opposed the petition. He wrote a letter to Gerald van der Zee's agent in Albany describing the tower's condition, its use during the blizzard, and its value as an emergency shelter. He included the measurements he had taken. He described the method in the precise, unemotional language of a man who had been wrong and was now determined to be exactly right. Nellie opposed it too. She came to a meeting at the church where Bell presented his case, and she stood up and said, "Moses Bell refused shelter to the Cady family during the storm because their account was overdue. Mara Devlin opened her door to my son when opening it could have killed her own children. I know which building I trust." The room was silent after that. Bell smiled the smile that no longer worked and said the matter was not personal. Nellie said the matter was a boy's hands and a woman's door, and that was as personal as anything in this valley had ever been. The petition stalled. Gerald van der Zee's nephew, who had never visited the tower and never would, decided the property was not worth the controversy. The tower remained in Mara's use. Bell retreated to the store with his ledger and his $29 debt, and the growing understanding that the debt was the last leverage he possessed, and that even leverage has a half-life when the person holding it has already lost the room. Mara did not celebrate. She went back to work. The upper roost needed repair before the deep winter. The nesting holes needed clearing. The cleaning hatch needed fresh lime. The grain schedule needed adjusting for the larger colony that had settled in since the blizzard. She climbed the outside ladder and worked in the upper chamber alone. The birds watched her from the ledges. Some had been roosting since March. They did not fly when she moved among them. They knew her. She knew them, not individually, but as a presence, a warmth, a partnership between species that required nothing except an open arch and scattered grain, and the understanding that shelter is not a transaction. She pressed her palm against the brick where Barbro's handprint remained. The stone was warm. The second winter came to the Hudson Valley the way second chances come to people who have earned them, slowly, with work attached. By December of 1888, the tower operated as a system rather than an experiment. The upper roost held a resident colony of over 400 pigeons with space for 1,000 more during storms. The nesting holes had been cleaned, repaired, and re-lime washed. New ledges replaced the broken ones. Grain was scattered on a schedule Mara kept in her head, mornings and evenings, upper ledges only. Enough to sustain, but not enough to make the birds dependent. They still foraged in the valley. They still flew. But they returned to the tower the way tenants return to a sound building, because it was theirs. The lower chamber had been refined. The tin ceiling now included 4 removable panels on Barbro's sliding track, allowing Mara to clean the upper hatch without disturbing the main seams. A second layer of quilts hung on the walls for deep winter, with paper packed between the layers. The raised plank floor that Mara and Eamon had built in October kept bedding and bodies off the cold brick. The cracked stove, fitted with a shortened pipe and sealed at the joints with clay, served only for cooking. It had never been the heart of the room's warmth. The birds were the heart. Pigeon manure from the upper chamber filled 14 barrels by Christmas. Mara traded it to 3 gardeners for root vegetables, dried beans, and a sack of wheat flour. The manure was clean, dry, and potent, exactly what Barbro had taught her to produce by scraping dry, sifting the powder, and storing it in barrels away from rain. What the town had once called filth now had a price that other people set. Mara kept a ledger, not of debts. She had enough of debts. She kept a ledger of repairs and lessons. Which family had sealed their walls? Which barn had a partitioned loft? Which chimney needed inspection before the next storm? Which children had learned to hold a candle near a door and read the flame? Eamon helped her write the entries. His handwriting was better than hers. At 9, he had become the kind of boy who noticed when a draft changed direction and who could read Barbro's thermometer without being asked. He did not talk about his father often, but when he worked with tin, he handled it the way Thomas had handled wood, with patience and a belief that materials had preferences that could be learned. Claire kept the birds. It had started as a game. She climbed the outside ladder and sat among the roosts, and the pigeons tolerated her because she was small and quiet and brought grain in her pockets. By winter she knew which nesting holes held pairs and which held singles. She knew which birds arrived first during storms and which waited until the wind drove them. She named none of them. Barbro had told her not to name animals you cannot promise to keep, but she knew them the way a child knows the trees in a yard, by shape, by habit, by the particular sound each one made settling in for the night. The January storm of 1889 was not a great blizzard. It was a common Hudson Valley freeze. 3 days of hard cold, wind enough to drift snow across the roads, temperatures low enough to crack water buckets left outside overnight. A normal winter event, the kind that killed only the unprepared. Moses Bell was prepared for his own comfort. His store had a sound stove, seasoned wood stacked to the ceiling of the back room, and a supply of lamp oil that he sold at a markup during shortages. What Bell was not prepared for was a family standing at his door at 9 o'clock at night. The Hardings were a young couple with an infant, 3 months behind on their store account. They lived in a cabin 2 miles west whose chimney had cracked during the autumn and never been properly repaired. When the cold snap drove smoke back through the crack and into the room, they wrapped the baby and walked toward the only light they could see, which was Bell's store. Bell opened the door. He looked at the Hardings. He looked at the infant, red-faced and coughing from the smoke. He looked at the ledger on his counter where the Harding account sat 3 months overdue. "The store's closed," Bell said. He said it with the door half open and the warm air spilling past him into the dark, where a woman held a baby who could not stop coughing. "Please," Harding said, "just until morning." "The store is closed," Bell said again, and he shut the door. The Hardings walked to the tower. Mara opened the door before they knocked. She had heard the footsteps in the snow and the baby's cough carrying across the frozen air. She pulled them inside. She wrapped the infant in a warmed blanket. She fed them broth. She gave them the bedstead and slept on the plank floor with her own children. The birds above numbered 600 that night. The tin ceiling was warm to the touch. The thermometer read 54 degrees near the center. The baby stopped coughing within an hour. Word spread the way it always spread in the valley, through the people who saw the Hardings leave the tower the next morning, warm and fed, and through the people who had seen Bell's door close the night before. No one organized a boycott. No one made speeches. The valley simply adjusted its understanding of where warmth lived and where it did not. Families who had bought on credit from Bell for years began walking the extra mile to the store in the next village. Men who had laughed at Mara's tower 8 months earlier now nodded when they passed her on the road. The nod cost them nothing. It cost Bell everything. His reputation did not collapse.
It eroded. The way a riverbank erodes, one handful of soil at a time, invisible on any given day, obvious over a season. 3 weeks after the Harding incident, Bell came to the tower. He came at dusk when the birds were entering the upper roost and the tin was beginning to warm. He came carrying a boy, his clerk's son, 14, who had been sent to deliver a message to a farm and gotten lost in a second cold snap that arrived without warning. The boy's ears were white. His coat was soaked through. He shivered in a way that involved his entire body, a shaking so deep it looked like the cold had reached his bones and was trying to rattle them loose. Bell stood at the threshold. Mara stood inside. The birds above had been settling for the past hour, filling the roosts in the particular order they had established over the autumn, older pairs in the deep holes, younger birds along the outer ledges, the newest arrivals pressed into corners near the arched openings where the wind was strongest, but space was available. The tin ceiling ticked and warmed in increments that Mara could feel through her palm without touching it, the way a woman feels a stove heating in the next room. "I suppose you will want me to say I was wrong," Bell said. Mara looked at the boy. His lips were the color of old wax. His shivering had the rhythm of something mechanical beyond his control. His hands gripped Bell's coat with the blind strength of a body fighting for heat. "No," Mara said. "I want you to hold that boy upright while I warm his chest." Bell stepped inside. He held the boy the way a man holds something he does not understand, carefully, stiffly, with the awareness that his hands were performing a task his pride had not authorized. Mara wrapped heated stones in cloth and pressed them against the boy's ribs the way Barbro had taught her. Center of the body first, extremities last. She placed one stone against his back and one against his chest and held them there with strips of cloth tied across his shoulders. Eamon brought broth. Claire climbed the outside ladder to check the upper roost and came back saying the birds were settling thick, over 1,000 by her count, and the tin was rising. She said it the way she reported all bird information, as fact without excitement, the same way Barbro had once reported wall temperatures. The boy's shivering slowed. His grip on Bell's coat loosened. His eyes, which had been squeezed shut against the cold, opened and found the ceiling above him. He watched the tin and listened to the birds moving beyond it and did not understand what he was hearing. "What is that sound?" the boy asked. "Birds," Claire said. "They're keeping you warm." The boy looked at Claire as though she had told him the ceiling was made of living fire. He did not understand. He did not need to. His color was returning. His ears went from white to red, which meant the blood was coming back and the tissue was alive. Bell stood in the room he had mocked and held a boy steady, while a widow he had tried to ruin pressed warm stones against a chest that would have stopped breathing on the road. Above him, 2,000 birds shifted and murmured and pushed their heat into tin and down into a space that existed because a woman had refused to die the way the valley expected her to. He did not apologize. He did not convert in any way that could be called noble. He became useful because circumstances left him no alternative, the way a man becomes useful when the only tool available is his own hands and someone tells him where to hold. When the boy was warm and sleeping, Bell stood at the door. He reached into his coat and pulled out his ledger. He tore out the page with Mara's account. $29. He set it on the shelf beside the lamp. "That is done," he said. He left. Mara looked at the page. She folded it and placed it in the stove. The paper burned in 3 seconds. $29 of debt turned to ash in the time it took to blink. She had carried that weight since Thomas died. She had felt it in every negotiation, every refusal of credit, every moment Bell had used it as a lever against her. It was gone. The ash floated up the shortened pipe and into the cold air and disappeared. Julian Reeve arrived in the valley in late February of 1889, hired to repair the church roof where the blizzard had torn copper sheeting loose from the ridge beam. He was 39, a tinsmith from Troy, a widower whose wife had died of typhoid 3 years prior, and whose grief had turned into work the way some men's grief turns into drink. He worked with metal the way Mara worked with warmth, precisely, respectfully, and with the understanding that materials had rules that could not be broken, only learned. He heard about the Pigeon Tower from the sexton whose roof he was mending. The sexton called it a curiosity. Julian called it interesting and walked the half-mile to see for himself. He expected superstition. He found engineering. Mara was on the outside ladder when he arrived, replacing a tin sheet that winter moisture had buckled. She was hammering the new sheet flat against the joist with short, angled strokes that left dimples in the metal but kept the seal tight. Julian watched for 2 minutes before he spoke. He watched the way she handled the tin, the angle of her hammer, the pattern of her nails. Then he said, "Your seams are overlapping the wrong direction." Mara looked down. She saw a man she did not know criticizing her work from below.
"The water runs south on this slope," Julian said. "Your overlap faces south. Rain will creep under the upper sheet and sit on the joist. In 2 seasons, the wood will rot. Flip the overlap. Upper sheet over lower sheet. Water runs off instead of under." He was right. Mara knew he was right because she could see the logic instantly, the way she could see a draft when someone held a candle near a crack. She had been overlapping by habit, the way Barbro had shown her, without accounting for the exterior slope that Barbro had never needed to consider because the interior ceiling was flat. "Who are you?" Mara asked. "Julian Reeve. I work tin." "I can see that." She climbed down. She handed him the hammer. He climbed up, flipped the sheet, and re-nailed it in half the time it had taken her, because his hands knew the metal the way her hands knew the walls. That was the beginning, not of romance, of recognition. 2 people who understood the same material from different directions, discovering that the gap between their knowledge was not a barrier, but a seam that could be overlapped. Julian improved her tin work. He showed her how to fold edges rather than bend them, creating a doubled lip that resisted moisture and held flat without nail heads exposed to rust. He brought scrap metal from the church job without announcing it, sheets of copper too small for the roof, but perfect for patching the tower's weak points. He left the metal by the door the way Nellie had once left a bundle of rags, without knocking, without asking for credit. Mara rejected one of his designs. He wanted to replace the flower paste seams with soldered joints, using a small iron and lead wire. Mara said no. The lead would drip during hot summers. Any drip that reached the lower chamber would poison the air. Julian argued that lead solder was standard. Mara said standard was not the same as safe. He thought about it for a day, and came back with tin solder instead, which was harder to work but carried no poison. She taught him why thick iron was not always better. He assumed the ceiling should be heavier to hold more weight. She showed him, palm against the metal, the way Barbro had shown her, the way her father had shown her, that thinner metal warmed faster and conducted more. The ceiling was not a floor. It was not meant to bear weight. It was meant to pass heat. Thin was the whole point. He taught her safer riveting. She taught him how to read a wall with his hand. He brought copper. She brought knowledge. Neither kept score. The courtship, if it could be called that, happened in the language of materials. Julian noticed that Mara's hands were scarred at the knuckles from months of lime work and tin handling. He made her a pair of leather palm guards cut from scrap, stitched with waxed thread. She wore them. She did not thank him in words. She wore them every day, and he saw them every day, and that was the conversation. Mara noticed that Julian worked too long in cold weather without stopping to eat. She began leaving food at the workshop, bread and cheese wrapped in cloth, placed on his workbench without announcement. He ate it. He did not thank her in words. He ate it every time, and she saw the empty cloth every time, and that was the conversation. One evening in November, Julian was working late in the workshop, folding a piece of scrap copper into a replacement vent cover for the tower. Mara came to check his progress and found him holding the copper against the lamp, studying how the light moved through the thinnest spots. "You test metal the way Barbaro tested walls," Mara said. "I test metal the way my father tested metal. He was a coppersmith in Albany before the work moved to factories. He said every sheet has a grain like wood. You work with it or you fight it." Barbaro said the same thing about brick and about people. They looked at each other across the workbench. The lamp threw their shadows against the wall. Two shadows, separate, angled toward each other like two lines that had been traveling for years and had finally found the point where they met. Julian said, "I am not going back to Troy." Mara said, "I did not ask you to leave." That was as close to a declaration as either of them came. The rest was built, the way everything in Mara's life was built, with hands and time and materials that had rules which could be learned. Eamon liked Julian because Julian taught him to fold tin edges and did not treat him like a child. He liked Julian because Julian had the same quality Thomas had possessed, the ability to explain a thing by showing it rather than saying it. When Eamon bent a tin edge wrong, Julian did not correct him with words. He bent the edge again, correctly, and handed it back. Eamon watched and adjusted. The learning happened through the metal, not through the air between them. Claire liked Julian because he did not try to replace her father and did not pretend the tower was anything other than what it was, a building that worked because two women had understood something the valley had missed. He called the birds "your tenants" when he spoke to Claire, and she corrected him each time, "They are not tenants. Tenants pay rent." Julian said, "They pay in heat." Claire said, "That is different." And Julian agreed that it was. By the third winter, the valley had changed in ways that visitors would not have noticed, but residents measured in their bones. The tower sheltered its resident bird colony above and kept the lower chamber ready for emergency guests below. Mara no longer needed to scatter grain daily. The pigeons had established territory. They bred in the upper roosts and raised squabs in nesting holes that Claire maintained, with the careful attention of a girl who understood that the birds were not pets, but partners. A typical storm night at the tower now had a rhythm. At dusk, Mara checked the vent, the tin seams, and the water supply. Eamon stoked the stove enough to heat broth. Claire climbed the outside ladder and counted birds, calling the number down through the upper hatch. 800. 1,200. Too many to count. When the count passed 1,000, Mara knew the night would hold above 50 degrees without any fire at all. She lit the lamp, closed the leather vent to half, and waited. If someone came, and someone often came, because the tower was now the place people came, Mara opened the door. She had settled the argument with Barbaro's ghost. 8 was the safe number. She kept to 8, but she had also trained 4 other households to receive emergency guests, so the valley's capacity was not 1 tower but 5 shelters, each adapted to its own building and its own heat source. The need spread the way Barbaro had wanted it to spread, across many rooms, not crushed into one. 3 neighboring barns had adapted animal heat sleeping alcoves. Nellie's smokehouse loft was the model, the simplest and the easiest to copy. A partitioned space above a smoking chamber, sealed with lime and rags, vented at the floor, warmed by the residual heat from the chimney and the body heat of anyone sleeping above. Nellie had tested it herself through 2 cold snaps and reported to Mara that the temperature held steady at 48 degrees on the worst night, which was not luxurious, but was the difference between sleeping and shivering. Ansel Katie's cow wall partition was the most elegant. He had bricked a thin wall between his sleeping alcove and the cow stall, using mortar no thicker than his thumb, One cow on the far side raised the alcove temperature by 8 degrees. Two cows raised it by 14. Mary Katie had delivered their first child in that alcove during a February storm, warm enough to unwrap the blankets for the birth, and Ansel told anyone who would listen that the child's first breath was warmed by a Guernsey heifer named Patience. Varick's stable loft conversion was the most ambitious. He had used estate funds to install a proper tin barrier between the horse stalls and an upper sleeping chamber, and had written the specifications in his ledger with the same precision he once used to catalog estate property. He showed the ledger to visitors with the particular pride of a man who had been wrong once and intended never to be wrong again. The church kept lime, rags, and tin scrap in a chest near the vestry for emergency sealing. The minister did not fully understand the method, but he understood that Mara had asked and Varick had endorsed it, and Nellie had organized the collection, and those three names together carried more authority than any objection he could raise. Children were taught to check drafts with candle flames before storms. This became a game, then a habit, then a skill that parents expected the way they expected children to know which berries were safe to eat and which paths flooded in spring. Pigeon manure from the tower fertilized spring garden beds across 4 farms, and the word draft entered the valley's vocabulary as a thing to be measured and stopped, not merely endured. People no longer spoke only in cords of wood. They spoke in drafts, partitions, shared walls, animal lofts, dry bedding, and controlled vents. The language of warmth had expanded because one woman had refused the old vocabulary and invented a new one. Varick became the unlikely messenger. He carried Mara's method to men who would not have listened to a widow, but would listen to a former estate steward with measurements written on the back of his hand. He visited farms and inspected barns and told men what they needed to hear in the language they were willing to accept. He said thermal conductivity when speaking to educated men, and thin metal lets warmth through when speaking to everyone else. He told them what he had told himself: measure the heat before you measure the pride. When a farmer near the creek dismissed the method as woman's science, Varick said, it kept 7 people alive through the worst storm in your lifetime while you burned your table. Call it what you want, then build it. Nellie became Mara's strongest practical ally. She inspected imitations before they went wrong. When a tenant family sealed a sleeping alcove too tightly, packed every crack with rags, and hung blankets over the vent, Nellie found them before the air went bad. She cut a vent hole with her own knife and lime-washed the edges, and told them what Barbro had told Mara. Warmth that poisons is not warmth. She corrected the dangerous the way Barbro would have corrected it, without lecture, without blame, with a flat stick and a pot of lime, and the patience of a woman who had once thought the method was madness and now considered it essential. Mara and Julian married in the spring of 1891 after 2 years of shared work. The ceremony was at the church with the repaired copper roof that had first brought Julian to the valley. Varick attended and gave Mara a carpenter's pencil wrapped in a piece of tin, the same pencil he had used to write measurements on the back of his hand the day he admitted the tower had value. Nellie attended and brought a smoked ham and did not pretend it was extra. Bell did not attend, but he sent a tin of lamp oil without a note, which was as close to a wedding gift as Moses Bell was capable of producing. Julian built a proper door for the tower, hung on iron hinges he forged himself. He built a second room attached to the base using salvaged brick and estate lumber that Varick authorized. He built a workshop where he and Eamon could work tin during the day, with a forge and a workbench and tools that accumulated the way Barbro's tools had accumulated, one by one, over years, each one earned. The tower remained the center. The birds remained above. The method remained free. Eamon apprenticed with Julian and learned sheet metal with the same quiet competence he had learned everything since the day his mother handed him a candle and told him to watch the flame. By 15, he could fold a tin edge cleaner than most men twice his age.
By 18, he took commissions of his own. He worked copper and tin and occasionally iron, and the people who hired him said his joints were invisible, which was the highest compliment a tinsmith could receive. He married a farmer's daughter from Kinderhook and built a house with a partitioned loft above the kitchen, heated by the cook stove on one side and sealed with tin on the other. His wife said it was the warmest bedroom in the valley. Eamon said it was physics. Claire kept the pigeons. She understood the colony the way her mother understood the walls, by feel, by habit, by the particular knowledge that comes from years of daily attention. She fed the birds. She cleaned the roosts. She tracked breeding pairs and noted which nesting holes held eggs each spring. She kept a small journal of bird arrivals and departures, weather patterns, and colony numbers, that eventually filled 4 volumes written in the careful handwriting of a girl who had grown into a woman who noticed things. In later years, she taught school in the village and kept a small dovecote behind her own house, and the children she taught learned about drafts and heat, and thin metal the way other children learned about presidents and rivers. She told them the story of a Norwegian woman with a bent hand who once said that filth is only filth when you do not know where to put it, and the children remembered that lesson longer than they remembered anything else she taught them. The years compressed the way years do when a life has found its shape. Julian grew gray. Mara grew lean. The tower's brickwork settled and cracked and was repaired and settled again. Birds hatched and flew and returned and died and were replaced by birds who had never known. A time when the tower was empty. The arched openings near the crown wore smooth from generations of wings passing through. Mara never became rich. That mattered. The story was not about wealth. It was about a woman who had been given a discarded building and converted it into knowledge that could not be repossessed. The method lived in Nellie's smokehouse and Varick's stable loft, and Ansel Katie's cow wall partition, and the church chest, and the children who checked drafts with candles, and in every household that had learned to think of heat not as something purchased and burned, but as something present and captured. No one could take that. No ledger could record it as debt. No lawyer could file papers against it. The knowledge was free because Mara had kept it free, and it spread because free things spread the way heat spreads, outward, downward, into every space that will receive it. In the years after the blizzard, Mara's method traveled in modest, practical forms across the valley and beyond. Not every house had a pigeon tower. Most did not. But 11 families within 6 miles of Kinderhook Creek adapted some version of the principle. Make the room smaller, stop the draft, separate clean air from foul air, and capture heat already present in animals, bodies, brick, and stored warmth. 3 farms built loft chambers. The church kept emergency tin. Varick wrote the measurements in his estate book, the same kind of book he had once burned for heat during the blizzard, and the pages survived longer than he did. Mara lived the rest of her life near the tower. She never left the valley. She never traveled farther than Troy, where Julian had family, and where she once spoke to a group of tinsmiths about sealing conductivity and sealed rooms, and was met with the polite silence that men offer a woman who knows more than they expected. She came home and told Julian the silence meant she had been heard. He said the silence meant she had been right, which was harder for some people to forgive. She died in 1916 during a mild winter, with the tower still standing and birds still entering the upper holes at dusk. Julian had died 4 years before her. Eamon ran the tin workshop. Claire kept the Dovecote. The lower chamber still held a bedstead, a stove, and a thermometer that Barbro Vangen had once carried in a canvas sack, along with a hand drill, a claw hammer, and a jar of flour paste mixed with ash. A deputy had once stood in cold March mud and handed Mara Devlin folded papers while her youngest child gripped a cracked blue mug. Abram Varick had walked the tower that week and said, with the certainty of a man who had measured buildings his entire life, a woman cannot winter in a pigeon tower. Years after Morrow was gone, a winter storm moved across the valley. The wind found the arched openings near the crown and pushed through them the way it had always pushed, restless, indifferent, carrying cold. Birds entered the upper holes one by one, then in pairs, then in clusters, until the old brick crown trembled with life. Below, the room waited with its lime-washed walls, its folded tin seams, and the faint smell of straw and lime that had sunk into the brick the way memory sinks into a house where someone has lived well and long. A child pressed one hand to the ceiling and smiled. The tower was warm,